A father cast his daughter into the depths of the sea, intending to end her life. Yet what he could never have foreseen was that this act of betrayal would instead become the beginning of her rebirth. Lisa often found herself stifling sobs, holding back the tears that threatened to betray her. She knew too well that any sign of emotion would only fuel Camilla's cruelty. Her father, Joseph, though present in the room, seemed a million miles away, lost in a fog of confusion. He was no longer the strong protector she remembered. That man had vanished, replaced by a hollow shell of his former self. Camilla's disdain for Lisa was as obvious as it was relentless, her icy glare and cutting remarks following Lisa like a shadow. No mistake was too small to be turned into a weapon. Dear Joseph, she is unable to earn income for family. She is nothing but a burden, Camilla spat, her words soaked in venom. At just 6 years old, Lisa carried the heavy burden of isolation in the house that had once been her sanctuary. Since Camilla had entered their lives, the warmth of family had evaporated, leaving behind only a cold, suffocating tension. Camilla's voice sliced through the silence like a blade, each harsh word etching itself deeper into Lisa's fragile heart. Lisa, how many times do I have to tell you? You're worthless. Every insult was like a dagger, and each glare from Camilla twisted it deeper. Joseph, caught in Camilla's tightening grip, fidgeted nervously, avoiding Lisa's gaze as if pretending not to see would erase the pain she was feeling. He had once been her hero, the man who had cradled her with love and affection. But now, Lisa was invisible to him. She longed for the father she had before Camilla came along, for the bond they once shared before it had been poisoned by Camilla's bitterness. One night, when the weight of tension in the house felt unbearable, Lisa crept to the top of the staircase, her small body hidden in the shadows. She had learned to sense when something was coming, and tonight was no different. Camilla, sitting with her back straight and her expression cold, delivered an ultimatum that would change Lisa's life forever. Joseph, either you get rid of her, or I'm gone. I can't take it anymore. Her words were sharp, final, like the slamming of a door. Lisa's heart raced, each beat thudding loudly in her ears. She wanted to run, to scream, to cry out for her father to protect her, but she remained rooted in place, terrified of what was about to unfold. Camilla's impatience boiled over as she stood up abruptly, her eyes narrowing. Stop hesitating, Joseph. It's me or her. What should have been an impossible decision for any father, a choice between his child and his wife, seemed to be reduced to a practical solution in Camilla's mind. Lisa, trembling in her hiding spot, could barely breathe as she waited for her father's response, her small hands gripping the banister with white-knuckled fear. Though Joseph, broken and weary, finally turned to face Camilla. His voice wavered, almost too quiet to hear. I think you're right, he murmured, avoiding Lisa's gaze, his words thick with shame. Camilla's lips curled into a triumphant smile, her victory sealed in that one devastating moment. For Lisa, those words felt like a death sentence. Her heart, which had once overflowed with love for her father, now shattered into pieces too small to ever be put back together. In that instant, the little girl who adored her father realized she had been cast aside, discarded like something worthless. The pain of his betrayal cut deeper than any of Camilla's cruel words ever had. At that moment, Lisa's world crumbled. Dad? Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with a pain beyond words. Joseph remained silent, the man who had once cradled her with love now drowning in his own despair. It will be better this way, Lisa, he said, though the lack of conviction in his voice betrayed him. It was clear he was trying to convince himself more than her. Lisa's fragile heart shattered. Camilla, triumphant, turned her back on the scene, while Joseph stood in the wreckage of his own silence. To him, Lisa had become invisible, a burden to be discarded. Trembling, Joseph finally said, "Go to your room, Lisa. I'll figure this out tomorrow." His voice was thick with the weight of his decision. With heavy steps, Lisa retreated, the tears she had been holding back threatening to overwhelm her. The fear she felt was no longer just of Camilla, but of the growing void between her and Joseph. In her darkened room, Lisa sat on the bed, listening to the haunting quiet of a house that no longer felt like her own. Each hour dragged on as Joseph, consumed by guilt, tossed restlessly in bed. Camilla slept soundly beside him, indifferent to the torment her ultimatum had caused. But Joseph's mind was a storm of regret. He was not just afraid of losing Camilla, but terrified of the monstrous act he knew he was about to commit. "There's no other way," he whispered to himself in the dark, trying to justify what he was about to do. The decision had already been made. The next morning, Joseph tried to mask the heaviness that weighed him down. But Lisa, with her sorrowful eyes, knew something was wrong. "We're going for a ride tonight, just you and me," Joseph said, forcing a strained smile. Lisa, caught off guard, hesitated before agreeing. It had been so long since her father had invited her to spend time with him alone, and despite everything, a small part of her still longed for the connection they once had. "All right, Dad," she murmured, her voice soft, clinging to a fragile hope. As the day faded and the evening grew dark, the sky was covered in a blanket of clouds and a chilling breeze swept through the air. Joseph helped Lisa into the boat, and together they set off into the vast, inky sea. The water reflected the darkness above, and with each stroke of the oar, Joseph felt himself sinking deeper into despair. Sitting at the edge of the boat, Lisa couldn't shake the growing unease that crept into her chest. "Dad, why are we going so far?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Joseph mumbled something unintelligible, avoiding her gaze. As they ventured farther into the endless sea, the tension between them grew unbearable. Lisa could feel the weight of something terrible hanging in the air. "Dad, it's getting too dark. Can we go back now?" she pleaded, trying to steady her voice. Joseph paused, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had dreaded but could no longer escape. "Lisa, he began, but his voice faltered. His hesitation lasted only a moment, but to him it felt like an eternity. In one swift motion, driven by guilt and despair, Joseph stood up, his face twisted with anguish. Lisa, sensing something was terribly wrong, stood as well, her voice trembling. "Dad?" Her question pierced the night, but Joseph had already made up his mind. With a quick, desperate motion, he grabbed Lisa by the arms. She struggled, panic setting in. "Dad, what are you doing?" she cried, her voice frantic. But Joseph's decision was final. He lifted her, and before she could fully comprehend what was happening, he threw her over the side of the boat. Lisa's body plunged into the icy water, the cold shock paralyzing her. Panic overtook her as she thrashed wildly against the dark waves, fighting to stay afloat. "Dad!" she screamed one last time, but the sea swallowed her cry. The boat and her father were already slipping away into the distance. Joseph, frozen in place, watched as his daughter struggled against the waves. His hands trembled as he rowed slowly away from the spot where Lisa was disappearing beneath the surface. The sound of her screams echoed in his mind, and the crushing weight of his guilt bore down on him. "What have I done?" he whispered, tears streaming down his face. He continued rowing, too afraid to look back, the enormity of his actions finally sinking in. The fear of losing Camilla now seemed insignificant compared to the destruction he had just unleashed. Lisa, gripped by panic, felt the crushing pull of the water dragging her deeper with every passing second. Her arms flailed wildly, but the biting cold and sheer terror were sapping her strength. She tried to scream, but her voice was drowned by the roaring sea. Her father's face haunted her thoughts, and she couldn't fathom why he had done this. "Dad, please," was her final plea before the waves swallowed her again. Darkness encroached, overwhelming her senses. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, and as her strength ebbed away, her body began to sink further into the abyss. The sea's cold embrace was unforgiving, numbing her once agile fingers. Her lungs screamed for air, and though she struggled fiercely against the waves, despair slowly crept in, replacing the last remnants of hope. Deep down, she knew this might be the end. Her thoughts, chaotic and desperate, circled around a single question. Why? Why did he do this? Just as Lisa teetered on the edge of life and death, a faint light pierced the fog. In the distance, a small fishing boat was making its way toward her, unknowingly about to alter the course of a tragedy. Mike, a humble fisherman accustomed to quiet days, was heading home after another disappointing haul. His nets were empty, and his mind was already on how he'd explain the poor catch to his wife. But something out of the ordinary caught his eye. Far on the horizon, through the churning waves, he spotted something, a small figure, struggling. "What on earth?" Mike muttered, narrowing his eyes and standing to get a better look. His heart raced when he realized it was a child, barely managing to stay above water. Without hesitation, Mike grabbed his oars, rowing furiously, cutting through the waves with every ounce of strength he had. "Hold on!" he shouted, his voice full of urgency. Lisa, her consciousness slipping, barely registered the sound of his voice. The cold and fear had all but overtaken her. As Mike neared, he reached out as far as he could, stretching until his hands finally grasped her. With careful strength, he hauled her into the boat, cradling her small, limp body. Lisa's skin was icy, and her breathing was shallow, as though she was on the edge of surrender. "My God," Mike whispered under his breath, immediately wrapping her in a worn blanket he kept in the boat. "You'll be okay. You'll be okay," he murmured, his words more to comfort himself than the child. He noticed how pale she looked, her fragile chest barely rising and falling. Mike's heart ached. "What happened to you, little one?" he asked gently, though he didn't expect an answer. Lisa, still trapped in the fear of the moment, stared blankly at the horizon, her body trembling with shock. Mike saw the lingering terror in her wide eyes and knew he had to act quickly. He pushed the boat forward, paddling with all his might, the sea tossing them with each frantic stroke. "We're almost there, just hang on," he called, trying to reassure her as the boat rocked violently in the tumultuous waves. As they neared the shore, Lisa slowly began to regain her senses. The warmth of the blanket and the steady rhythm of Mike's voice soothed her, providing a brief, flickering sense of safety. Her large, frightened eyes settled on Mike, still trying to grasp what had happened to her. Mike noticed her gaze and offered a kind smile. "You're safe now, little one," he whispered. Lisa, too weak to speak, managed a small nod, the first sign that maybe, just maybe, she had been saved against all odds. When they finally reached the shore, Mike was calmer. He lifted Lisa into his arms, holding her carefully as if afraid she might break. "Let's get you home, girl. You're safe now," he said softly as he made his way to his small cabin nestled in the village. His steps were measured, full of the quiet determination to protect this fragile child from any further harm. Every step Mike took felt deliberate, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders, but he knew in that moment something far greater was unfolding. Lisa had been saved from the treacherous sea, yet the danger she had faced, both in those dark waters and long before she ever reached them, remained a mystery to him. Mike's home was humble, crafted from aged wood, worn down by years of weather, but it held a warmth, a quiet refuge nestled at the edge of the village. As he carried Lisa inside, the crackling fire instantly enveloped her in its embrace, like a comforting hug she hadn't felt in like forever. Gently, Mike placed her down in a chair by the hearth, his eyes filled with deep sympathy. "Stay here. I'll fetch something warm," he murmured, his voice soft, hoping to ease the trembling that still overtook her. Lisa, though safe now, was visibly shaken, and the trauma of that harrowing night was etched into every fibre of her fragile being. As Mike brewed a pot of tea, he cast concerned glances toward her. She sat curled up, her wide eyes fixated on the dancing flames, yet her thoughts seemed miles away. What kind of life has this poor child lived? Mike wondered, his heart heavy with the weight of her unspoken pain. Every slight movement she made reflected the overwhelming burden she carried, far too heavy for someone so young. When the tea was ready, Mike approached her carefully, kneeling beside her with a cup in hand. "Here, drink this. It'll warm you up," he said, offering a gentle smile. Lisa took the cup with trembling hands, feeling the comforting warmth seep into her fingers. The silence between them lingered, thick and palpable, but there was no need to rush. Mike understood she needed time to feel safe again, and he had plenty of it to give. He offered her nothing but patience and quiet reassurance. Slowly, as the warmth from the tea and the fire spread through her body, Lisa began to relax. Though her eyes still held traces of fear, Mike noticed something new, a faint spark of hope. "You're safe here," he repeated softly, as if those words were the very antidote she needed. In the days that followed, an unspoken bond formed between Mike and Lisa, their lives falling into a comforting rhythm. Mike didn't press her with questions, respecting the fragility she carried, both in body and spirit. Instead, he gently introduced her to the calm beauty of the sea, taking her out fishing in quieter waters, helping her to see the ocean not as something to fear, but as something to understand. Though Lisa's gaze often wandered toward the horizon, lost in thoughts the sea couldn't answer. Mike noticed she was slowly growing stronger, more present. Gradually, what had started as a temporary shelter became something deeper. The village, Mike's simple home, these things became a haven for Lisa, a place she could begin to call her own. And, in some unspoken way, Mike was also changing. Ever since he had lost his own daughter years ago, he had closed himself off from the world, his heart locked away. But somehow, Lisa had awakened something inside him. He would watch her as she played with little treasures she found around the house, seashells, bits of driftwood that had washed ashore, and he couldn't help but smile. Despite the immense emotional wounds she carried, Mike could see her inner strength shining through. Day by day she worked to rebuild herself, and he admired her quiet resilience. The village itself, with its peaceful pace and warm-hearted people, began to embrace Lisa as well. The locals, always kind and welcoming, offered her small gestures of care, a piece of candy from the market women, a friendly wave from the fishermen as she passed by. In this place, so different from the cold and unwelcoming home she had known before, Lisa began to find something precious, belonging. Mike, too, noticed the change in himself. Lisa's presence brought life back into his quiet world, and the sorrow that had long overshadowed his heart began to lift. Seeing her smile, even at something as small as a piece of driftwood, stirred emotions in him that he hadn't felt in years. Though he knew Lisa still had a long road ahead, and the emotional scars she bore were deep, Mike was determined to help her find her way back. This girl is stronger than she knows, Mike thought to himself, watching as Lisa picked herself up bit by bit with each passing day. He couldn't help but admire her bravery, her quiet determination. And as the village continued to welcome her, a place that had once felt foreign to her was slowly becoming home. Whenever Lisa passed through the market with Mike, the women would always offer her candy, and the fishermen would wave in her direction with warm smiles. For Lisa, it was like stepping into an entirely different world. It was nothing like Joseph and Camilla's house, where the air was thick with tension and the walls seemed to echo with hostility. Here, the people seemed to genuinely care. While the trauma of her past still clung to her, she found herself slowly daring to believe that trust might be possible again, that she might one day smile without the shadow of fear. Mike observed her with a quiet pride, recognizing that her journey toward healing had only just begun. But he knew the first step was already taken. In this small, comforting refuge, Lisa was slowly finding her strength again. There were still nights when fear crept in, where dreams of that awful night at sea would jolt her awake. Yet now she had something she had never known before, a sanctuary, a safe harbor. Mike, with his patient kindness, offered more than just a roof over her head. He offered her a path to healing. As time moved forward, the bond between Mike and Lisa grew deeper. The heavy silences that once hovered between them, thick with unspoken pain, were gradually replaced by gentle conversations. Mike never rushed her, never pressed her to speak. He simply waited, giving her the space and time to open up on her own terms. One overcast afternoon, with the soft rhythm of the sea in the background, Mike found Lisa sitting on the porch, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. It was a sight he was all too familiar with. "You seem far away, Lisa," Mike said softly, his voice calm and steady. Lisa turned to him, her wide eyes reflecting something far more profound than sadness. Mike took a seat next to her, remaining silent for a moment. He knew the time had come to share his own sorrow, a burden he had kept hidden for years, hoping that by not speaking of it, he might escape the pain. "You know, Lisa," he began, his voice tinged with quiet melancholy, "you remind me so much of someone." Lisa's curiosity was piqued, and she turned her gaze toward him, waiting for him to continue. Mike inhaled deeply, as if preparing himself for what was to come. "I had a daughter once. She was your age when I lost her." His voice faltered as he glanced out at the sea, the waves mirroring the ache in his heart. "She loved the ocean too," he continued, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. "It was our special place. We'd go fishing together, or sometimes we'd just sit and listen to the waves, just like you're doing now." He paused, staring out over the water, lost in the weight of the memory. "But one day, there was a storm," he said, his voice growing heavier. "I wasn't paying attention, and she was taken by the sea, just like you almost were." His words hung in the air, each one laden with years of unspoken grief. Lisa sat quietly, absorbing the magnitude of what he had shared. For the first time, she realized that the man who had been her savior carried his own unbearable loss. "I've carried that guilt with me ever since," Mike admitted, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "The pain of not being able to save her, of failing as a father." His voice trembled as he looked at Lisa, emotion choking his words. "When I found you that night, it was like God had given me another chance. A chance to do what I couldn't do for her." Mike's confession struck Lisa deeply. She had never fully grasped why Mike had been so kind, why he had taken her in and cared for her with such devotion. Now, she understood that he wasn't just offering her a place to stay. He was healing a part of himself through her. "I'm sorry about your daughter, Mike," Lisa whispered, her voice soft but sincere, breaking the silence between them. The words were simple, but they carried a weight of empathy that Mike hadn't expected. He smiled, though it was tinged with sadness, and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Lisa," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "But you've shown me something I didn't see before. I can't change what happened to my daughter, but I can take care of you now, and that gives me hope." His words resonated within her, and for the first time, Lisa felt the depth of the bond that had formed between them. Mike wasn't just a man who had saved her. He was someone who, like her, was finding a way to heal. Lisa, stirred deeply by Mike's heartfelt words, felt a surge of emotion ripple through her. For the first time since that fateful night when she was cast into the sea, she sensed that maybe, just maybe, she could begin to release some of the heavy burden she had been carrying. Mike's story, with its own aching loss, had become intertwined with her own. In their shared pain, they found solace. They were no longer alone in their grief. The shadows of the past still loomed, but the connection between them was starting to foster a quiet, gradual healing. Both bore deep, invisible wounds, but together they were learning to move forward. Lisa remained silent, choosing instead to rest close beside Mike, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The same ocean that had taken so much from her now, in an unexpected way, seemed to offer them both a second chance. However, the tranquility Lisa had begun to find in the village was abruptly shattered one day, a day that would forever be etched in her memory. Mike was out at sea, busy with his fishing, and Lisa was wandering through the village square when she suddenly saw a figure in the distance. Her heart seemed to stop in its tracks. Joseph. There he stood, disheveled, unshaven, with hollow, vacant eyes, as though the weight of the world had crushed him. Lisa froze, paralyzed by a torrent of emotions. Fear, anger, and above all, the vivid memory of that terrible night when he had tossed her into the sea. How could he even dare to show his face after everything he had done? Joseph, however, was a broken man. After Camilla had Camilla-lessly betrayed him and cast him out, he was left utterly alone, without direction, without family. The guilt over what he had done to Lisa gnawed at him every waking moment, eating away at his soul. Now, standing in front of her, he barely resembled the man he once was. His eyes, bloodshot and pleading, sought some hint of forgiveness in hers, but found nothing. "Lisa!" he croaked, his voice strained and weak. But Lisa recoiled, stepping back, her face etched with the pain and terror that his sudden presence had reignited. "No!" she cried, her voice ringing out across the village. The fear that he had returned to finish what he had started that night seized her heart. Without a second thought, she turned and fled, her feet carrying her as fast as they could, not daring to look back. Joseph tried to chase after her, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, Lisa, just listen to me," he begged, his words thick with anguish. But his plea fell on deaf ears, his steps slow and hesitant, as though his guilt weighed him down like chains. To Lisa, Joseph's return was not just a shock, It was a threat, a dark spectre from her past that had come back to haunt her once more. Mike, returning from his fishing trip, saw the commotion from a distance. His instincts kicked in immediately. He needed to protect her. Rushing over, he found Lisa curled up behind one of the village cabins, trembling and in tears. "What happened?" he asked gently, his voice steady and calm despite the alarm rising inside him. Through her sobs, Lisa could only utter a single word. Joseph. The name hit Mike like a blow. His chest tightened as he processed what she had said. He knew exactly who Joseph was. He knew the tragic story that had torn this family apart. And now, here stood the man who had thrown his own daughter into the unforgiving sea, seeking redemption. Mike knelt down, placing his hands gently on Lisa's trembling shoulders, his voice barely more than a whisper but brimming with reassurance. "You're safe," he said softly, his words a promise. "I'm here." As Lisa clung to Mike, she saw her father, Joseph, approach with hesitant but determined steps. He knew what awaited him, her disdain, her fear, but he was ready to face it. Mike turned to meet Joseph, his gaze like cold stone. "What are you doing here, Joseph?" Mike's voice was firm, unyielding. Joseph paused, uncertain for a moment, then found his voice. "I've come for Lisa." His words trembled, as though they might shatter with the weight of regret. He glanced at Mike before his eyes shifted to his daughter, who stood partially shielded behind the fisherman, her wide, terrified eyes betraying her every emotion. "I know what I did. I know I don't deserve anything from her, but I need her forgiveness." The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm. Mike stood still, not even blinking, his expression unreadable as he took in Joseph's every word, every subtle movement. Lisa, shaken to her core, felt her heart pounding uncontrollably. The mere sight of Joseph brought a flood of memories she had tried so hard to bury. He was supposed to protect her, but instead he had tossed her into the cold, unforgiving sea, like she was nothing. "I can't forgive you," Lisa said, her voice trembling yet resolute. The words sliced through the air, sharp and clear, leaving Joseph visibly wounded. His face twisted with sorrow, and he dropped his gaze to the ground. "I understand," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, heavy with the weight of his remorse. Mike inhaled deeply, trying to remain calm despite the instinct to protect Lisa from the man who had caused her so much pain. Yet, as he studied Joseph's defeated posture, something inside Mike gave him pause. Joseph didn't appear as the heartless man who had committed such an unforgivable act. No, what Mike saw was a man crushed by the consequences of his own choices. "Lisa," Mike said, his tone steady but gentle in you don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But sometimes forgiveness is the only way to move forward." His words hung in the air, filling the space between the three of them. Joseph remained motionless, holding on to a sliver of hope, while Lisa stood frozen, wrestling with the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She didn't know what to feel, and the confusion was overwhelming. The man standing before her, broken and pleading, was the same man who had abandoned her, left her to drown in the dark abyss. "He threw me away like I meant nothing." Lisa repeated the thought to herself, trying to stoke the fire of her anger. But deep down, something stirred, something she didn't want to acknowledge. A part of her remembered the man he used to be, the father who was once her hero, long before Camilla had entered their lives and poisoned everything. That version of Joseph had vanished, but now, here he stood, trying, desperately, to return. "Why, Mike?" she whispered, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. "Why did he do it? How could he throw me into the sea? Mike, standing beside her, sighed deeply, his expression softening with understanding. Sometimes, Lisa, people make terrible choices. They lose their way, and in their desperation, they make decisions that haunt them for the rest of their lives. His voice was calm, reflective. Your father seems like he's trying to make things right, but whether or not to forgive him, well, that's up to you. Lisa turned her gaze toward Mike, her mind awash in confusion. She was torn between the rage she felt and the faint, painful memories of the father who once made her feel safe. Could that man still exist within the broken figure standing in front of her? He left me to die, she reminded herself again, clinging to the bitterness. Yet there was an undeniable conflict in her heart, something fragile, something vulnerable. Could she really hold on to this hatred forever? Could she ever find peace without letting go of the burden? The tears began to fall freely now as Lisa's emotions finally overtook her. Mike watched, offering her silent support, knowing this was a battle she had to face on her own. He had said his piece. The rest was for Lisa to decide. Joseph, still standing at a distance, was barely holding himself together. He knew he had no right to ask for forgiveness, but the thought of living the rest of his life with this guilt, without any chance of redemption, was unbearable. "I'll wait," he said softly, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'll wait as long as it takes, Lisa. I just want you to know. If I could go back, I'd do anything to fix what I've done. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes." The weight of Joseph's words pressed heavily on Lisa's heart. Anger, yes, it was still there, but fear of losing the chance to move forward gnawed at her too. Mike's words echoed in her mind. Forgiveness is sometimes the only way to heal. But how could she forgive the man who nearly destroyed her? For now, Lisa remained silent. Forgiveness seemed too far out of reach, yet the idea of clinging to her pain, of allowing it to control her, felt equally unbearable. Perhaps, she thought, this choice wasn't about Joseph at all. Perhaps it was about her own freedom, her own healing. How could she ever forgive someone who had nearly torn her life apart? From a distance, Joseph stood, broken and awaiting her answer. Lisa felt the heavy burden of everything weighing her down. Forgiveness in that moment seemed utterly out of reach, and the wounds were still fresh. "I can't, Mike. I just can't," she murmured, her voice trembling with raw emotion. Mike, with his usual patience, watched her quietly for a few beats before giving her a soft, knowing look. He spoke gently, hoping to offer her some guidance. "Lisa, I never had the chance to ask my daughter for forgiveness. She was gone before I ever could. And I've carried that regret with me all these years." His words sliced through the tension like a knife, making Lisa pause for a moment. Mike had always been her safe haven, her unshakable foundation. But realizing that even he carried such deep sorrow shifted something inside her. "Sometimes forgiveness isn't about the other person," Mike continued, his gaze locking with hers. "It's about us, letting go of the weight we carry, freeing ourselves from the pain." His voice was calm, but the trust in his words hit hard. Lisa glanced back at her father. Joseph looked fragile, consumed by guilt, yet the scars of nearly being drowned by him couldn't be erased so easily. The battle inside her heart raged on. "I don't know, Mike. I don't know if I can," she whispered, the conflict brewing in her chest. She remembered the days before Kamala, when Joseph had been her protector, her constant companion. But those memories were clouded by the haunting image of that night on the boat. The night the man who should have loved her most had thrown her into the abyss. Mike could see the internal struggle etched on her face. Kneeling beside her, he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder and said, "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, Lisa. It doesn't make what he did right. But it can mean choosing to move forward, choosing not to let his actions define who you'll be." His words, gentle yet firm, resonated with her. But the fear of opening herself up to being hurt again was a wall so tall she wasn't sure she could ever climb it. From the shadows, Joseph stood, silent but desperate. He was a man crushed by his own choices, his own sins, and the realization that he might never be forgiven gnawed at his soul. "I'll wait as long as you need, Lisa," he finally said, his voice thick with sorrow. "If I could turn back time, I would undo everything. I know I was wrong, and I get it, if you never forgive me. But I'll do whatever it takes." The weight of the moment pressed hard against Lisa's chest. The anger simmered, but so did the fear of never moving forward, of never having the chance to mend what was broken between her and her father. Mike's words rang in her head. Forgiveness wasn't just a choice. It was a lifeline. It wasn't about Joseph. It was about her. It was about reclaiming her own peace, her own healing. That night, Lisa lay awake, her thoughts swirling like an unstoppable storm. The decision to forgive him felt like the biggest challenge she had ever faced. In the stillness of the night, with moonlight filtering through the small window, she replayed her life with Joseph, from the warm, safe moments of her childhood to the horrific night he tried to abandon her to the sea. "How could I ever forgive him for that?" she whispered into the darkness, her heart tightening once more. Yet Mike's voice echoed in her mind. Forgiveness could be the key to her freedom. But what would it mean if she chose that path? The next morning, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, Lisa knew she needed space. She wandered down to the beach where the waves lazily kissed the shore. Sitting by the vast ocean, she felt the cool breeze sweep across her face, the same ocean that had nearly taken her life, but now offered her a strange sense of clarity. "I could hate him forever," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "But what would that do to me?" As she stared out at the sea, Lisa wrestled with the choice before her. Holding on to the pain felt justified, but she couldn't help but wonder if it was only holding her back from healing. The memories of her father's betrayal hurt deeply, but they were intertwined with moments of love and protection from her past. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about not letting it control her anymore. Perhaps in time she could forgive, not for him, but for herself. The weight of the question pressed heavily on her heart. Lisa knew that if she clung to this pain, it could unravel everything she was working so hard to rebuild, including the fragile sense of peace Mike had offered her. The memories continued to surge, unbidden. She recalled the father Joseph had once been, how he would hold her close, singing softly until she drifted into sleep. These cherished moments, long buried beneath layers of hurt and resentment, were starting to rise to the surface again. She knew that Joseph, before Kamala, had been a different man, someone she had loved deeply. Yet what he had done still cut her to the core. The fear of placing her trust in him once more haunted her. If I forgive him, how can I be certain he won't hurt me again? She wondered, the internal conflict tightening its grip on her. This decision was not one that would come easily. But as the hours dragged on, Lisa began to understand something, perhaps Forgiveness wasn't really about Joseph at all. It was about her. If I don't forgive him, I'll be carrying this burden for the rest of my life, she reflected, watching the waves roll onto the shore, now serene and calm. And if I do forgive him, maybe I can finally start anew. Mike had been right. Forgiving wouldn't wipe away what had happened, but it might be the first step in lifting the crushing weight that bore down on her heart. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the key to the healing she had been desperately seeking. By the time late afternoon arrived, Lisa found herself walking back to Mike's house. Her heart felt lighter, but the uncertainty about the inevitable confrontation still loomed large. Joseph was there, waiting for her, sitting at the edge of the beach. His gaze was fixed on the ocean, as if the turbulent waters could provide the answers he so desperately needed. When Lisa approached, he slowly lifted his head. His face, lined with guilt and sorrow, spoke volumes without a single word being uttered. She paused, taking in the man before her. This was not the same person who had thrown her into the sea. The pain of his betrayal still lived within her, but something in her heart had shifted. "Dad," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, softer than she had expected. Joseph turned toward her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. He hadn't known what to anticipate from this encounter, but the fact that Lisa had approached him at all filled him with a faint spark of hope. "Lisa," he began, his voice thick with emotion, but he quickly faltered. He took a deep, steadying breath, struggling to find the right words. I don't know how to undo what I did. I can't take back what happened. But I'm here, willing to try, if you'll give me a chance." Lisa stood in silence, letting his words settle deep within her. Confusion swirled inside her, mingling with the urge to relieve herself of the heavy load she had been carrying. She knew forgiveness wouldn't erase the pain of the past, but maybe, just maybe, it was the only way forward. After what felt like an eternity, Lisa spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm doing this. Not for you, but for me." Joseph, overwhelmed, felt hot tears slip down his face. The gratitude he felt was immense, but he understood that there was still a long road ahead. "Thank you, Lisa," was all he could manage, his voice barely steady under the weight of his emotions. Lisa knew deep down that forgiving Joseph was only the first step in a much longer journey. The pain, the distrust, they wouldn't vanish overnight. But something had shifted within her. By choosing to forgive, she wasn't merely extending grace to her father. She was liberating herself from the emotional cage she had been trapped in for so long. "Maybe I can finally move on," she thought, as a strange yet comforting peace began to settle into her soul. Joseph, on the other hand, was fully aware that regaining his daughter's trust would take time. But that first moment of forgiveness was the greatest gift she could have given him. It was a new beginning, and for that, he was eternally grateful. The village, with its tranquil rhythm, seemed more serene than ever. The gentle lapping of the waves against the shore, the distant chatter of fishermen returning with their day's catch, and the soft breeze wafting through the windows of Mike's humble home all contributed to the quiet harmony that now enveloped them. In that quiet seaside village, Lisa, Mike, and Joseph found themselves embarking on a path toward healing, a journey built not only on forgiveness, but on resilience and the strength to move forward. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope. Life, once defined by fear and sorrow, had started to blossom into something unexpected and beautiful. Joseph, who chose to remain in the village, worked alongside Mike in the fishing trade. What began as a relationship strained by suspicion gradually softened into a quiet companionship, anchored by their shared resolve to offer Lisa a new beginning. The fear that once shadowed Lisa's days was no longer her constant companion. Though the scars of her past remained, they had become a testament to her resilience, shaping her into someone stronger. Mike and Joseph, once distant figures in her life, now formed a protective circle around her. There were still moments when the weight of her memories pressed heavily on her chest. But gradually she found solace in the little things, the warmth of the sun, the sound of the sea. The village, with its sandy pathways and ever-present scent of salt water, was transforming into the home she never imagined she could have. Joseph, too, was committed to mending his bond with his daughter. He understood that Lisa's forgiveness wasn't an instant remedy for the damage done, but it was a door left ajar, a chance to prove he had changed. Each day, as he cast his nets into the sea, Joseph reminded himself of this chance. "I'll show her I'm not the same man," he vowed. Mike, who had been observing Joseph's quiet persistence, felt a deep sense of respect and relief. The man who had once shattered Lisa's world was now intent on rebuilding it, piece by piece. Mike knew he could never replace Joseph as Lisa's father, but the bond they were forming was unique, a friendship born from shared pain and slowly growing into mutual trust. The nights in Mike's small weathered house were filled with the simple joy of quiet conversations. Joseph and Mike would swap fishing tales while Lisa sat nearby, a soft smile occasionally crossing her face. The feeling of normalcy, something she had long forgotten, was slowly creeping back into her life. Joseph, still carrying the burden of his guilt, now allowed himself to laugh, albeit cautiously, during their evening talks. He was still a man in the process of rebuilding himself, but he was determined to invest his efforts into the new family they were creating together. "I never thought I'd have this again," Joseph admitted one night, his gaze lost in the distant horizon. "You gave me a second chance. Mike, I'll never forget that." Mike, shaking his head with a gentle smile, replied, "It wasn't me, Joseph. Lisa gave you that chance. I was just the bridge." As he spoke, Mike's eyes drifted to Lisa, who was playing on the shore, gathering seashells. To Mike, she was a living symbol of redemption. The girl who had endured so much was now the glue that held their fragile family together. Mike realized that, in taking care of Lisa, he had also begun to heal a part of himself that had been broken for so long, the part that had never recovered from losing his own daughter. What once was merely a temporary refuge for him had now become a permanent sanctuary for all of them. The village embraced their newfound family with open arms. Neighbors who knew the stories of both Mike and Joseph greeted them with warmth and understanding. As Lisa passed through the village square, people offered her candies and smiled kindly at her. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lisa no longer felt like the lost girl adrift in a storm of despair. With Mike and Joseph by her side, she felt secure. The cycle of suffering that had once defined her existence had been broken, and, in its place, a new cycle of love and forgiveness was beginning to grow. The final piece of their emotional puzzle had finally clicked into place. The family that Lisa, Joseph, and Mike had come to form wasn't flawless, but it was genuine. It was rooted in forgiveness, the quiet strength of each individual, and the collective yearning to move beyond the shadows of their past. In that small seaside village, where the soothing rhythm of the ocean mirrored the passage of time, they finally discovered the peace they had been longing for. Though the road of suffering and redemption did not come to a full stop, It was in that tranquil place that the seeds of a new beginning were sown. Life in the village, with its unhurried pace and uncomplicated ways, became the source of joy they had long been deprived of. Lisa, Mike, and Joseph's story reveals to us that forgiveness, while often arduous, is an indispensable step on the path to healing. Lisa's choice to forgive not only allowed her to mend her own scars, but also extended an olive branch to her father, giving him a chance to restore the connection they had once lost. Mike, with his unwavering compassion, illustrates the profound impact of empathy, while Joseph bears the heavy burden of regret, yet also demonstrates the courage it takes to seek atonement. Together, their journey reminds us that healing is a process, and it begins when we find the strength to forgive, both others and ourselves. As we reach the end of this tale, we're left with a powerful reminder. The road to healing is rarely easy, but it is essential. Lisa's journey, fraught with betrayal and pain, showed us the quiet strength it takes to forgive, not just for others, but for ourselves. In the heart of that humble seaside village, forgiveness became the bridge that rebuilt a shattered family, piecing together lives once fractured by regret. Mike, with his quiet empathy, Joseph, with his broken but determined heart, and Lisa, with her fragile but unyielding resilience, show us that redemption is possible, even when the wounds run deep. Through their journey, we learn that love is not always perfect, but it is real when it is built on honesty, patience, and the courage to move forward. What are your thoughts? How would you navigate the complexities of forgiveness and healing if you were in Lisa's place? Share your reflections in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story that invites us to explore the depths of the human experience. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Until next time, stay inspired.